Hi, this is Jamie Stegmeyer with Stonemeyer Games, and this week I'm going to talk about sensitive and controversial subjects and themes in tabletop games and how different tabletop games approach these sensitive themes. I'm going to jump around a little bit. I have some overarching categories I'm going to go into. And up front, I want to say a special thank you to Alex over at the Tales of the Tabletop YouTube channel. It's a new YouTube channel. Alex is a friend in my gaming group, and he's been provided some great insights into a few different games. And also Andrew Lowen, who is working on a game called Deliverance. And so I'm going to look over a few times at my other monitor here and read some thoughts that they've shared with me about certain games, because I thought they said it in a really nice way that I may not be able to repeat as eloquently here. So let's jump right in. So one of the topics I wanted to cover is how different games approach religion. And this is actually the original impetus for this video, because Andrew reached out to me and he had some questions about why I didn't include religion in Tapestry. And he had some thoughts about how he is including religion in his game Deliverance. So in Tapestry, I wanted to mention the reason. So Tapestry is a civilization game where you are creating your own civilization from early mankind into the future. And it doesn't really, while certain paths are linear, like the technology track is linear, the science track is linear. The science track doesn't prevent you from moving up on the technology track and so on. So you might have a civilization that is very advanced in science and maybe not advanced at all in technology. So you are not following real world history at all. So I very well could have included a religion track in the game that follows this linear format that I have in the game, where you start off with, say, very basic technology and advance to very advanced technology. But the reason I didn't include religion is because who am I to say that one religion is less advanced than another? There are religions created very early in mankind that might seem archaic to some today, but for all we know, those religions could be much more advanced than religions, or we might come back to those religions someday. Who am I to say that those religions are less advanced than others? And so it just did not seem appropriate, did not seem like a place for me to say that one religion is more advanced than another using the linear track format that I use in Tapestry. Now, Tapestry also does have tech cards that can be played completely out of order of real history. So I could have used a religion deck and just had let players play religion cards in the order that felt most appropriate to them. But again, that just felt a little weird. To have a whole deck just for religion. I know religion is a huge part of the history of mankind. It has been the reason that we fight wars. It's been the reason that we've stopped wars. It's played a role in all the different tracks that are in Tapestry and in real world history. But it was kind of just a subject that I didn't want to approach in the game. I wanted people to be able to apply their own beliefs if they wanted to the game or not. And I didn't want that to be a part of the game. Now, Andrew has taken a different approach, and I found it really interesting. In his email, he discusses the fact that there are a lot of games that have religion as a pretty big part of those games, including Norse. So he uses the word mythology in the email to me, but these are, even though they're mythological to many people today, they are probably still, or they are, some of them are still real world religions to people today, and they definitely were in their own time. And so there's Norse mythology found in games like A Feast for Odin, Blood Rage, Raiders of the North Sea, Champions of Midgard. They're dripping with Norse mythology. There's also Greek mythology found in Santorini and Lords of Hellas. Tzolkin, one of my favorite games. Tzolkin approaches religion from the Mayan religion. The whole game is about the Mayan calendar, which is tied to the Mayan religion, and it has cult tracks in the game that you move up in the game. These temples that you are advancing on in the game itself. As well as Seven Wonders. Seven Wonders discusses religion from kind of the civilization game perspective. And I guess the overarching thread through all of them, as Andrew points out, is that these games don't apologize for their use of religion, nor do they try to really educate players or say that these religions or these mythologies are necessarily true or correct. They don't try to convert anyone to them. They are simply part of they're simply just part of the game. They're integrated into the theme and the mechanisms of the game without, as Andrew uses the word, without proselytizing, word that I cannot clearly say, and I will not try to say again. But let's and, oh no, Andrew says it in a quote here, so I have to say it again. So Andrew then goes into Christianity, a religion that is still very prevalent today. It's a religion that I think over 1 billion people follow, and he says he's talking about in his very detailed email to me, and I'll link in the post below to his full post about this, which I think you'll find interesting if you find this topic interesting. That he looked at all these games that use Norse mythology, Greek mythology, other mythologies and religions, and he found the commonalities of what made them work and what made them not very controversial to people. And he tried to apply those same principles to his game. So his 3 core things that he focuses on is, he says, I don't apologize for my use of religion in the game. I don't attempt to educate the player on my religion as part of the game's core loop, but instead use it as flavor and to better explain the mechanisms and goals of the game, which I think all these other games do as well. And finally, number 3, he says, I don't take any of the subject matters trivially. I'm extremely well researched to be theologically sound in every possible way, just as someone could research a mythology or research any belief system from any point in time in history. Andrew explains what the game is about a little bit, which I think will help for the context of this a little bit. The game is called Deliverance. He says Deliverance is a game where you play an elite angel from the army of heaven, and you've come down to investigate the high amount of demonic activity in the small secluded town of Fallbrook. It is a game of angels and demons with the saints caught in between. And as I read that, I haven't played Deliverance. I don't know much about it more than what Andrew's described. But as I read that, it reminded me, honestly, a little bit of the theme of Cthulhu. And Cthulhu kind of has its own religion system in it. It's not one that is encouraging anyone to follow, because it's this cult-style religion of a group of people trying to raise up Cthulhu and, I guess, end the world. And the theme of Deliverance sounded a little bit like that as well, but just from a slight lens of Christianity. So I like these tenets that Andrew has observed in these games where religion has not seemed to offend people, and religion and mythology have not seemed to offend people, and he's applying them to his own game, Deliverance. And I applaud him for doing so. I think that if there is any way to apply religion to a game or to use religion in a game, this is perhaps the way to do it. So let me move on from religion for a second and move on to one of the other topics. And this is one, so this is a weird one to include back to back, but I want to be able to jump around in this video a little bit. Whereas we may disagree about what religion is right or what religion we follow or how we see people practicing religion. One thing that I don't think that we are going to disagree on is that slavery is terrible, right? Hopefully we can all agree with that. So I'm going to talk about topics like that are not really up for debate as to whether or not they are bad or not, or how they or how bad they are, but rather how different games approach slavery. Slavery is a very sensitive topic. It's a part of our history, and so. But certain games have chosen to include slavery in those games. I think some do it well, and some do it a lot less well. Let me start with one that does it well, and that is Freedom, the Underground Railroad. I think Freedom, and it's tough for me to say exactly what makes it kind of not work, but for it to be appropriate that slavery is part of the game. But basically, Freedom is actually trying to, unlike the religious example I gave, Freedom is trying to educate players of how terrible and scary of a time it was for slaves who were trying to escape to the north in the United States to freedom. Slavery happens all over the world. This was designed from the American perspective. And so it lets you see how scary of a time it was for those slaves who were trying to find freedom and get out from their captors. It uses real world history, a ton of real world history in it. It also represents slaves in the game, or the people who are trying to escape from slavery, as cubes, which I found to be a very interesting choice. I don't know necessarily if it was the right choice or not. In some ways, the game is dehumanizing the slaves by representing them by cubes, but I think this was a very intentional design choice to not have them be like meeples or things like that. You do see, I believe, in the art in the game, you do see the faces of a number of people. So in that way, it doesn't actually dehumanize those slaves in the game. But it was, I thought, an interesting choice to make. My experience of freedom definitely helped me. It was both an educational experience, and it helped me kind of relate to how scary of a time it was for the slaves and for the people who tried to help free the slaves and get them to the north. And so in that, I thought the game succeeded in having slavery as the theme of the game. There are a couple games where slavery is included in the game for reasons that are well, for one of them is beyond me, and one of them is just kind of adjacent to it. So the first one is Five Tribes. I mentioned this in a recent video where I replayed Five Tribes after not playing it for many years, and found that I enjoyed the game much more than I originally did. And yet I still found, and this was one of the original printings of Five Tribes, I found it baffling that the designers decided to include slave cards in the game. And from what I've read, the designers justified it by saying that slaves were a part of real-world history in the Middle East where the game is set. But the game also has genies or jinns in it, which were not, as far as I know, as far as history has told us, are magical creatures were not actually a part of real-world history. And so the designers took a creative liberty in including magical creatures, which is great. I think they're a great part of the game, but their justification for including something from real-world history no longer works, I think, because they also included the magical creatures in the game. So that I don't understand. And in subsequent printings, they have changed the slave cards to something else. So I think they heard feedback, and I applaud the designers for doing that. I don't know why they made that choice initially, but they're human. They made a mistake, and I'm glad that they changed it to something else. Another example is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a classic Euro game where you are positioning people that you have enslaved. The game doesn't go into that all that much, but these are enslaved people that you are positioning to do whatever you want them to do. And they are represented by little brown tokens here. This game has gotten a lot of flack for that choice, and I agree with the flack that it has taken. I think that's kind of a really unfortunate approach that Puerto Rico took. And I think, so part of the tough thing here is that, and this delves back into the religion discussion, that there probably was a way for Puerto Rico to approach the colonization of Puerto Rico itself, the real world colonization of it, and how people in Puerto Rico were enslaved. They probably could have approached this without any mechanical changes, really, maybe a component change, but no mechanical changes, if they had talked about it in the rule book a little bit and talked about what that subjugation meant for the people of Puerto Rico. And maybe subsequent printings have done this, but I did not find it in the rule book where they talk about this subject. But if they had broached the topic in the rule book, I think that would have really helped to let people know that, hey, this is what you're doing in this game. Learn from it. Learn from the experience. Learn from how terrible this is. Even if as you make clever strategical decisions, learn from those decisions that you're making. And a game that I think does this a little bit better is Archipelago. I can't really speak in detail to Archipelago because it's been a while since I played it, but Archipelago does not shy away from that. They talk about it in the rulebook. It's a big part of the game in terms of how the colonization aspect of the game is happening. That actually takes me into the next topic, which is colonialism. And how different games approach it. Because colonialism often means that one nation comes into another area or a country or a region and subjugates the people there. And there are a number of games that use this as a theme. I'm not sure how intentionally or not, but they do. Puerto Rico is one of them. Maracaibo and Archipelago are two other ones. I think Archipelago does it, represents it with as much grace as they possibly could. It's very upfront. It's a big part of the game. And I might be speaking incorrectly there, but because one of the things in Archipelago that can happen is the game can end if the people rise up against you. But I think even in that is a good way for the game to show that you are doing a bad thing to these people. And so they are justified in rising up against you because of what you're doing to them. One game that takes a slightly different approach, or very different approach, is Spirit Island to colonialism. In Spirit Island, the people, you are kind of struggling against the people of the country, of the island that you are on, that you're part of, and you're playing as spirits in the game. It takes a little different approach. And actually, let me let Alex talk about it, because Alex says it really well. So Alex says, Spirit Island, this is a game. This game is in a lot of ways an anti-Puerto Rico or Catan, where you're driving off the colonialists. In Spirit Island, the spirits are actually working with the natives to drive away the colonialists. That's what Alex is saying. Alex says, however, despite that, it doesn't actually treat the natives much better, as they are tools to be used, sacrificed, or ignored, and their well-being generally has nothing to do with winning the game. So I thought that was an interesting perspective, that the designer took a very interesting approach and has you side with the natives, essentially, as they try to force the colonizers off the country or off the island. But at the same time, it still looks at the natives as tools to be used. I thought Alex said that really well. Way better than I did, trying to stumble through that. Let's see. Let's jump to a completely different topic, which is relationships. This is another great example that Alex gave me about Fog of Love. So this is a different type of sensitive topic, but if you've ever played Fog of Love, you know that the game brings up some topics that are sensitive in terms of relationships. And it does so in a really interesting way. In some ways that really work, in some ways that don't. An example of this is, and Fog of Love is a two-player romantic comedy game, but it does bring up some sensitive subjects. One of them, an example would be revealing that you had an affair. And so there's at least one place in the game where you might reveal to the other person that you have had an affair, and part of the game is kind of deciding how that person responds to it. And the reason this can be sensitive is because people have been cheated on, and people have cheated, and people have experienced that in real life. And so this coming up in a game might be a really sensitive, touchy subject. And the game does a couple things that are good and bad, I think, in how they deal with this. The good is that the game doesn't have you play as yourself. Rather, you are role-playing as a different character. And so it kind of creates this separate entity, this separate platform to broach these subjects in a way that is maybe a little bit, makes it less sensitive, but also can lead to some great discussions about it through this role-play format. At the same time, let me look at Alex's comment here. Alex says, I think this game actually does a pretty good job of allowing the player to touch on a number of potentially sensitive subjects within the realm of relationships. I don't think it does as good of a job of creating a safe space to touch those relationships, though, as it's often one player springing a topic on another, which is true. It kind of these topics come up out of nowhere, instead of depending on players to have a level of trust in each other if such topics come up. So again, I see this as good or bad. I think for the most part the game does it really well, but it has led, I've heard, to some relationships, real life relationships, having some difficulty after playing the game because it's bringing up all these sensitive subjects that hopefully we can communicate about, but that isn't always the case. Let's talk about R rating. So I wasn't quite sure exactly how to put this, but like explicit themes. And Alex gave me a great example for this too that I wasn't even aware of. I have Dead of Winter, but I don't have Dead of Winter: The Long Night. And Alex says this about it. Like the original Dead of Winter, this has a crossroads deck, but there's also a separately packed set of cards that's labeled as sensitive topics, none of which are explicit in themselves, but describe things such as finding someone chained in a basement. They are separated in such a way that you can choose not to include them in the deck if you're not comfortable with them potentially coming up. I thought this was great. It's kind of like having the choice between watching a PG-13 cut of a movie or watching the R-rated cut. Making both available, maybe on Blu-ray or DVD, so that you have the choice between the two of them. And I thought that was really clever that Dead of Winter did this. There are other games that kind of label it and let you know that it's something for mature audiences might be coming. An example of well, I'll get to my thoughts about it in a second, but an example of that is Time Stories Estrella Drive. This was probably the most controversial module for Time Stories, because it, I guess slight spoiler here if you haven't played this module, but it deals with a real, it doesn't use the real names, I don't think, but it deals with a real life event, a real life killing, real life slaughter, really. And it does label it. It says, on each pack of cards, it says this is for mature audiences, which is great that they labeled it. But I think they got a lot of flack for doing this game, or this module, because they, rather than dealing with something fantastical, as many of the modules do, which are clearly fictional, they dealt with something that was very real and very raw to some people who lived through it. It's about the Manson murders, this kind of cult of people that followed someone and murdered a few people in Hollywood. And so the idea of replicating something that really happened in real life, I think, does not work as well, I think, as a fictional theme. It's one of the reasons that I love reading fantasy and science fiction. I can escape into another world and see and kind of experience these very sensitive things that happen, and hopefully apply the things that I've learned and felt and observed back in the real world. But I'm not experiencing that thing that really happened in the real world, rather like real world history. There's benefits to that too, but in a game, I don't know if that's the best format to do it in. But that's up for debate. I completely understand if you have a different opinion about that. And kind of related to that, I wanted to mention the whole idea of war and killing in games in general. It's interesting that we might debate some of these topics and whether or not and how games approach some of them. Like, obviously, I've been kind of harsh on Five Tribes for their inclusion of slavery in the game. But there are so many games that include war and killing, which is very immoral and unethical. But it's a huge part of many games. We play these games where we fight each other, where we essentially kill another opponent's units, and we often don't even think twice about the fact that we are murdering someone. I guess murder is a little bit different in the context of war, but it's still pretty. It's up there. It's one of the reasons that that the types of that tactical combat games don't really appeal to me all that much. I don't have fun spending an hour or an hour and a half just trying to kill all the bad guys, because in my mind, are they really bad? I mean, these orcs and ogres, don't they have families? Don't they have friends too? Aren't they more one-dimensional than just that they have a desire to kill me or my character? That aspect of the theme of war and killing and tactical combat and dungeon crawling and just fighting and hacking and slashing, that doesn't appeal to me all that much. That's a personal choice. And it's not even really entirely that the theme is off-putting, but it just seems a little lazy. There are so many other ways to navigate through a maze. Even if there is a creature who is full of hate, or a person who is full of hate and definitely wants to kill my character, there are other ways to get past them than just killing them, than just murdering them. A couple other topics that I'll mention here are drugs. Some games have drugs in them, and they deal with those with drugs in different ways. One example that I haven't played that someone mentioned is Narcos. And I think that the way that Narcos gets around it, and it really doesn't get around it, they kind of acknowledge that the damage that drugs can do to people, to infrastructures, to families, is that they embrace that in the way that the game shows you what's happening surrounding the drugs, the violence that can happen around them. But also, I think it abstracts the drugs a little bit. It doesn't glorify it. Basically, it does not glorify the idea of consuming or selling drugs, even though it is very much a part of the game's template. I could be wrong about that, though. I haven't played it, so I'd love to hear your opinions about that. Last is kind of a weird one, is using... I'll use Nazis as the example here. So there are games that involve Nazis where you can play... and I'm kind of stumbling over how I want to approach this, but I think it is universally... fairly universal that what Nazis did was wrong, and I know many of them were just German citizens who were enlisted and didn't have a lot of choice into whether or not they wanted to be enlisted. But as we look back in history, we see what the Nazis did and what Hitler did as being horrific and terrible and wrong. And so, but a lot of games have you play as the Nazis, like Axis and Allies. Classic game, Axis and Allies. One of you is playing the Nazis among other countries on that side of World War II. There's also Secret Hitler, where one player is secretly Hitler. And so I struggle a little bit with how I feel about these types of games, because again, I don't know necessarily, I don't think they're glorifying that idea of being a Nazi or being Hitler even at all. I don't think the games do that, but I do find it to be an interesting thematic choice. I don't even necessarily think it's something that we should shy away from those dark moments in history, but it's more about I think the games, kind of going back to what Andrew said about religion. Actually, it's almost the opposite of what Andrew said about religion, and that these games can serve to educate a little bit about what was wrong, what was bad about these aspects of history, and to not glorify it. Yeah, this is a weird topic to discuss. I hope I haven't misspoken too much here about these topics, because I am bringing them up because they are sensitive, and because I think it is interesting that game designers have decided to include some of these themes in games, and I think it's interesting the way that they've approached those themes in games. So I'd love to have a productive, insightful, and progressive discussion about this in the comments. I might be a little bit more. Well, we'll see how the conversation goes. I'm very curious to see how this conversation goes, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about games that apply sensitive topics in ways that are helpful and productive, and games that don't. I'd love to hear both examples. Thanks.